December 17, 1944. Just before sunrise, the snow along the northern edge of the Ardennes was thick enough to swallow sound. Frost hung like crystal teeth from pine branches, and the tanks parked along the treeline looked like they'd been frozen mid-charge. Sergeant Callan Roth stood knee-deep in slush behind the maintenance truck, hands wrapped around a dented thermos of bitter coffee, staring at the distant columns of smoke curling above the forest's edge. It was the fourth Sherman that week. Tank number 14 had stalled. Again. But this time it didn't restart. Roth had been dispatched within minutes. They'd heard the screams before they saw the wreck. The transmission over the motor pool radio was flat, emotionless, filtered through static. Sherman 14 down. Crew trapped. Request immediate recovery. By the time Roth's jeep skidded to a stop next to the blazing wreckage, it was already too late. The hatch was half blown, wedged shut by blast deformation. Flames licked through the seams in the turret like fingers trying to claw their way out. The stench of burning canvas and hydraulic fluid hit him before the heat did. Inside, 5 men. Roth didn't know their names. One was still alive. He could hear him. That was the part he would remember. A single voice, hoarse and ragged, screaming for someone. Frankie! Frankie! Open the hatch! Get me out! God! Frankie! Then the screaming stopped. The heat radiating off the hull seared Roth's face. He dropped his glove trying to pry the hatch, reached for it with bare hands, and instantly felt the skin on his palms sizzle. He staggered back. Useless. Too slow. Too late. Again. Tank engines don't just fail in cold weather. Not like this. Not with 5 men trapped inside. He'd seen it before. 3 times now in the past 10 days. Shermans that started fine during warm-up. Ran clean for 5 minutes. Then sputtered. Stalled. Died. The same way every time under load during maneuver in extreme cold. The Army called it cold flow variance. Engineers chalked it up to wartime supply tolerances. But Roth had spent the last 2 winters in field garages across Europe. He knew what frostbite looked like, what tank engines were supposed to sound like at -12. This wasn't variance. This was design failure. And it was getting men killed. Back at the field depot, the staff sergeant in charge of maintenance reports had just waved it off. You want warmer engines, Roth? Tell Eisenhower to move the battle south. Then he laughed. Roth didn't. The charred skeleton of Tank 14 was still smoldering when he climbed under the rear chassis and found what he expected. The main fuel line had separated just behind the pump brace. A pressure clamp had flexed under thermal stress, cracked at the seam, and dumped raw gasoline near the manifold. Once the engine turned, the vapor ignited. Boom! Standard field clamp. Standard materials. Standard death. But not acceptable. Roth climbed out, arms black with soot. The skin on his right palm blistered and raw. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and stared at the wreck for a long time. Not saying anything. Not thinking. Just memorizing every crack in the hull, every twist in the scorched steel, until it was burned into his mind like the scream still echoing in his ears. He didn't sleep that night. Just sat alone at his workbench in the corner of the unheated maintenance tent, staring at the clamp he'd salvaged from the wreck. Something had to change, even if it meant breaking every damn rule in the manual. The morning after the fire, the snow had turned a sickly gray around the burned-out Sherman, melted and refrozen into jagged crystals that cracked under Roth's boots. The wreck still steamed in the cold, a twisted monument of blackened steel half buried in slush. Roth crouched beside the engine compartment, breath hanging in the air like smoke, and ran his fingers over the ruptured fuel line. The metal was brittle to the touch, fractured along a seam so fine it looked like a pencil scratch. A hairline crack, tiny enough to miss during inspection, deadly enough to kill 5 men inside 10 seconds. Roth reached into the twisted chassis and pulled the clamp free. It came off too easily, sliding into his glove with the limpness of something defeated. He turned it in his hand. The steel was thin. Not weak, just not designed for this kind of cold. He tapped it against the hull. The sound was wrong. A hollow, almost delicate ping. Not the dense metallic snap he expected. Fuel starvation under cold compression. he muttered to himself. No pressure. No combustión. No chance. He could still hear the voice from yesterday, the crewman screaming himself hoarse, begging. More than once in Roth's life, he'd heard men die. But there was something different about hearing someone die because of a part you knew would fail, a part the Army insisted was within spec. He radioed Battalion Maintenance Command. Reporting repeat cold-induced clamp failures. Request replacement guidance. After a long pause, the reply crackled through static. Insulate the lines better. Roth stared at the radio like it had insulted him. Insulate? Against a metal tolerance issue? That wasn't a fix, that was a blanket thrown over a bullet wound. He radioed again, this time higher up. Sir, the issue is not insulation. The clamp is flexing under sub-zero. The response came back clipped, impatient, dripping with bureaucratic distance. Sergeant Roth, you are a mechanic. Maintain the equipment you are issued. Do not recommend engineering corrections again. Click. Silence swallowed the motor pool bay. Roth let the radio fall to his side. His jaw tightened. No one in HQ had touched a Sherman this winter. They hadn't felt the metal freeze under their palms or watched a crew die because some supply officer in England signed off on parts meant for autumn operations. Not December burial. He walked back toward the maintenance tent, snow crunching under his boots, face numb from the cold and anger. Inside, the heater was dead again. The only warmth came from a lantern flickering weakly on a crate of spare parts. Tank silhouettes lined the canvas walls from outside, black shapes breathing in the freezing air. Roth sat at his workbench and placed the broken clamp on the table. He pulled off his gloves, ignoring the stinging pain in his blistered right palm, and traced the crack running through the metal. Perfect failure line. Predictable. Preventable. His pencil hovered over a scrap of paper. A blueprint? Au fixe. Even drawing one was technically a violation. Unauthorized modification sketches counted as intent to alter, a court-martial offense. He drew anyway, not because he wanted to break rules, because he could still hear that man screaming inside the Sherman, a sound louder than any regulation. He tossed the broken clamp into a parts tray, leaned forward, and whispered into the cold, empty tent. This is the last time. The wrench didn't feel like a tool anymore. It felt like rebellion. Sergeant Callan Roth stood at the back of the maintenance tent, holding the cracked fuel clamp between two gloved fingers like it was a war crime disguised as hardware. The cold had seeped into every part of the depot. Metal hissed under touch, and canvas roofs snapped with each gust of Arctic wind. Beyond the tents, Sherman tanks sat still and steaming, their breath rising into a sky so pale it looked already dead. Tank number 14 wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. But it would be the line. He pulled a crate closer to the kerosene lantern on his bench. A faint yellow glow that flickered like it, too, was afraid of the cold. Inside the crate were discarded parts from all over the theater. Shattered turret brackets, snapped recoil mounts, worn drive sprockets. One piece caught his eye, a triangular bracket from an A-20 Havoc wing strut. Salvaged from a wreck months ago. Heavy-duty, high-carbon steel. Still intact. Too strong to throw away. Too forgotten to be missed. He dropped the broken clamp beside it and grabbed a graphite pencil, scribbling on the back of a rations manifest. The sketch started crude. A C-shaped band with overlap at the base. Notch tension teeth. Deeper bite on the fuel line curve. Then he rotated the design, remeasured the arc, and added cold expansion tolerances. He'd never been to engineering school, but 8 years of fixing tractors back home in Nebraska had taught him one thing. When steel flexes at 20 below, you need bulk, not theory. The Army spec sheet showed clamp tolerance of plus or minus 0.7 millimeters at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. But at minus 15, it buckled like a biscuit tin under a boot. He dug into his tool roll and pulled out a fine file, a pair of vice grips, and a hacksaw. The piece of aircraft bracket went into the vise, and the sound of saw teeth chewing metal filled the silence. It was a lonely sound, illicit, measured. He shaved the edges down to a crescent, mimicking the inner arc of the Sherman's fuel line, then punched a pilot hole at each end, wide enough for bolt tension, narrow enough to avoid lateral shift. His hand slipped halfway through the second hole. The drill bit gouged across the bracket, skipping and drawing a thin line of blood from his knuckle. Roth didn't flinch. He wrapped his bleeding hand with a shop rag and kept working. Sparks flew from the grinder, bouncing off the frost-covered floor. His breath fogged the air like smoke from a smoldering oath. By 0330, he had something that didn't exist in any manual. A thicker, colder, angrier version of the original clamp, shaped not by design, but by necessity. A fuel clamp built for vengeance. No one else was in the bay. The night watch was asleep. The officers were in the mess, sipping coffee brewed with frostbitten indifference. Roth, alone, held the new clamp in his hand like a silent prayer. It wasn't pretty, but neither was war. He walked over to the stripped engine block they'd been using for training, lined up the new clamp, fit it to the curve, locked it down. Then, with a gloved hand, he tested the flex. Nothing. No give. No bend. No play. Steel against steel. Commitment against collapse. It was heavier, bulkier, and it wouldn't pass inspection. But it wouldn't break. And for the first time in weeks, Roth felt something in his gut that almost resembled hope. Or maybe defiance. Or maybe both. He dropped the clamp into his pocket, wrapped the sketches in oilcloth, and walked out into the snow. His boots left deep, solitary tracks across the moonlit ice. No one saw him disappear into the shadows behind tank number 32. But history doesn't always start in broad daylight. Sometimes it begins with a whisper and a wrench. It was 0420 when Roth knelt beside tank number 32, the cold turning his breath into white plumes that curled and vanished against the dull steel skin of the Sherman. The only light came from a distant signal flare that had gone off earlier by accident, still glowing faintly in the sky like a fading bloodshot eye. Everything else was dark, quiet, frozen. The depot slept, but Roth moved with a thief's precision. He slipped beneath the tank's rear access cowling, flashlight clamped between his teeth, and began unbolting the original clamp. It was buried just behind the fuel pump casing, where the steel line bent toward the engine manifold. A tight, awkward spot that required knuckles to bend and hope to hold. The bolts were half seized. Frost welded them to their housings. Roth's hands shook from the cold, not fear, as he forced the socket loose with deliberate torque. Every click of the ratchet echoed like a gunshot in his ears. He paused, listened. Nothing but distant artillery like a tired drum in the east. With a final twist, the standard clamp dropped into his gloved palm. Cold, thin, the same flawed part that had cost 5 lives yesterday morning. He pocketed it like evidence, then pulled the new clamp from inside his jacket. It looked wrong. Not by design, by survival. Its curve was thicker. Its bolts sat wider. Its bite was stronger. But to anyone glancing quickly, it was just another clamp. Nothing more. Nothing worth court-martial. Roth aligned it with the fuel line, working with one hand while steadying the flashlight beam with his elbow. The fingers on his left hand had started to lose feeling. He ignored it. Sweat slid down his back despite the frigid air. The cold had a way of making things quiet, unnervingly so. Even the tank itself seemed to hold its breath as the new clamp seated into place. The bolt holes lined up. First try. He gritted his teeth and forced the bolts through. They resisted, just slightly. The steel didn't want to obey. But Roth had learned long ago, things that resist are often closest to working. He tightened the clamp until it bit flush against the fuel line. No gaps. No flicks. Then, with one last turn, he tested the line for movement. Nothing. No shift. No sag. No betrayal. He exhaled slowly, pulling his wrench away like it was a detonator. The fuel line looked ordinary, but Roth knew what it was. An unsanctioned ghost hiding inside a war machine. A ghost no engineer would ever admit existed. He wiped the area clean with a grease rag, bolted the casing back on, and crawled out from under the tank into the sharp morning air. His knees cracked, his back ached, but his mind was clear. He stood for a moment in the snow, staring at the tank like a man watching over a child sleeping in a war zone. Somewhere out in the trees, German panzer tracks were carving paths through frostbitten dirt. The battle would come. The cold would return. The tanks would move. And when they did, this clamp, this invisible act of war against engineering indifference, would be the only thing keeping the engine from stalling, the crew from dying. Roth turned without ceremony. Walked back across the depot yard alone, boots crunching through a layer of new snow no one had walked yet. The kind of snow that erases tracks in minutes. The kind of snow that forgets heroes. Back at his bench, he took the damaged clamp out of his pocket, held it up in the lantern light and said nothing. Just watched the crack shimmer faintly like a wound that never heals. Then he crushed it in a vise, slow, deliberate, until the metal gave with a soft groan. 1 down. 9 more tanks to go. December 19th, 1944. The cold that morning didn't feel like weather, it felt like judgment. Every bolt in the depot screamed under the pressure of -16 degrees. Canvas tents sagged under frost. Oil cans froze. Even breath sounded brittle. Roth stood outside motor pool row 3, fingers twitching inside his gloves. Eyes locked on tank number 32 as its crew climbed aboard in slow, mechanical motion. He knew the mission orders. Flank patrol East Ridge. 7-mile circuit through snow-laced forest, engine idle at half throttle. The kind of terrain where Shermans usually choked within the first mile. Especially in weather like this. Roth watched Halvorsen, the tank commander, shout a systems check into the open hatch. Battery 1 green. Fuel. Topped. Primer pressure. Holding. His voice came out sharp against the silence. Only 2 other tanks were prepping nearby, both already sputtering with cold start fatigue. Tank number 17 had stalled twice before its gunner even climbed in. Roth didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on number 32. This was it. First field test. No logs. No approval. No backup plan. Just a homemade steel clamp hidden beneath the armor of an American tank. The engine crew inside keyed the starter. Nothing. 1 breath. 2. Then the whine of cranking teeth. Starter motor catching. Roth's heartbeat stopped. The Sherman coughed once. Then again. Then, a full-throated rumble. The kind of sound you feel in your boots. Deep. Alive. The tank exhaled smoke and heat. Not white like most mornings, but black and burning hot. Clean combustion. Steady output. No backfire. Halvorsen's voice crackled through the radio. Tank 32 green across the board. Moving out now. The treads groaned and rotated forward, breaking through the iced-over mud like a plow tearing open old scars. Roth stood in place as the Sherman rolled past him, steel grinding against frozen earth, and watched the snow tremble beneath its weight. 1 mile. 2 miles. No stall. No hesitation. Radio transmission came through 10 minutes later. Fuel pressure holding at idle and load. No anomalies. Engines damn near purring. Roth didn't smile. He just turned and walked back toward the tent. Inside, he threw off his gloves, grabbed the aircraft bracket from his bench drawer, and started grinding the next clamp. Halvorsen returned 2 hours later. Hatch open, goggles around his neck, face red from the cold, and sweat. He found Roth under a tarp near the tool cabinet. "You do something to the engine?" he asked, almost casually. "She didn't fight me today. Started like it was spring in Kentucky." Roth shrugged. "Might have flushed the lines yesterday. Or maybe it's luck." Halvorsen laughed. "Well, if it's luck, bottle that S***T. And just like that, he walked away. Roth stared at the clamp in his hand. Still unfinished. Edges raw. Steel warm from grinding. He rotated it slowly in the pale tent light, watched the sharp corners catch the glow, and whispered to himself, "Let's see if luck holds." By nightfall, 2 more tanks had been fitted. No records, no orders, just the sound of engines, and the silence of those still dying in tanks that hadn't been touched yet. December 20th. The cold didn't let up, it only learned how to whisper. The morning sun hung low like a lazy executioner behind a curtain of gray clouds. Snow blew sideways across the depot, filling toolboxes and exhaust vents like a slow invasion. Roth was back at the grinding wheel, shaping his fourth unauthorized clamp, when he heard the boots. Not tank boots, not mechanic boots, officer boots. Polished, too clean for this weather. Lieutenant Vance, logistics officer, quartermaster liaison, a man who spent more time signing forms than lifting spanners. Roth had seen him around before, tall, fresh-faced, clean chin, clipboard always under his arm like it was bolted there at birth. "Sergeant," Vance said, stopping just short of Roth's bench, eyes narrowed beneath a wool cap. "Got a moment?" Roth didn't stop grinding. "What's on your mind, sir?" Vance held up a clipboard. "Fuel line performance on Tank 32. Something's changed. Yesterday it ran 9 miles in sub-zero terrain without a hiccup. You do anything unusual to it?" Roth wiped a line of sweat from his brow. Even in the cold, the grinder's heat worked through his jacket. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Cleaned some buildup near the manifold. Maybe the cold's finally letting up." Vance didn't smile. "It was -14. Roth shrugged. "Sherman must be blessed." Vance took a slow step forward and nodded toward the bench. "That bracket doesn't look standard." "Tool mount," Roth lied. "Salvaged from an A-20 wing strut. Stronger than what we've got. Keeps the breaker bar from sliding around." The lieutenant didn't buy it. He leaned in, lifted the half-finished clamp, turned it in his hand. "Looks a hell of a lot like a modified fuel clamp," he said flatly. Roth met his eyes, calm, measured. "Then maybe the A-20 should have been a tank." For a few seconds, neither man said anything. The only sound was the occasional ping of distant engine warm-ups, and the low hum of the depot's generator sputtering in the wind. Vance finally sighed, set the clamp down, and flipped a page on his clipboard. "You're not authorized to fabricate system components." "Didn't know we were still doing things by the book, sir," Roth said without blinking. "Be careful, Sergeant," Vance replied, voice clipped. "Paperwork has a longer memory than field rumors." And just like that, he left. But Roth didn't relax. He stood still for a long time, staring at the clamp on the bench, thinking about what came next. He knew what this meant. The clock had started ticking. Someone had noticed. Not the generals. Not engineering command. But one man with a clipboard was all it took. Outside, Tank 17 rumbled past the bay door, one of the first he'd secretly modified. The engine sounded like confidence. Controlled. Balanced. Alive. Roth turned back to his grinder. The machine screamed against the steel, sparks leaping like defiance in the dim light. He'd just been warned. Officially. And he had no plans of stopping. Because every clamp he made, every ghost part he buried into steel, meant another crew had a fighting chance. And Roth wasn't just building hardware anymore. He was buying time. One illegal bolt at a time. December 22nd, 1944. The storm didn't come gently. It arrived like a siege, unannounced, violent, and absolute. By dawn, visibility had collapsed to mere feet. Wind screamed through pine trees like incoming artillery. Snow draped itself over tank barrels and treads until they vanished into unrecognizable lumps of frostbitten armor. The depot looked abandoned. But it wasn't. Men moved like ghosts under canvas flaps. Mechanics worked with torches in mittens. Engines were dead. Batteries frozen solid. Tanks that had roared yesterday now sat mute, their breath stolen by the cold. It was what the manuals called operational halt. Except it wasn't halting. Not all of it. Because 6 Shermans started that morning. No one had ordered them. No one expected them to start. But they did. Roth stood under the bay awning, wool cap soaked in ice, jaw clenched against the sting of wind. Across the yard, Tank 32 fired to life like a furnace, thick, dark smoke belching from the exhaust, warming the frozen air. Next to it, Tank 17 groaned once and then stabilized into a low, pulsing idle. The rest of the yard? Silence. Engines dead. Crews cursing. Jump starts failing. But Roth's tanks? Every single one that had his modified clamp? Alive. Vibrating. Ready. A captain from 3rd Armored stumbled over from the other side of the depot, coat flapping like a broken sail. His breath came in panicked clouds. "How the hell are yours starting?" Roth, covered in black grease and flurries, answered without emotion. "Might be cleaner fuel, or good preheat discipline." The captain squinted through the snow. "That ain't it. I've got diesel pooled under half my line. Fuel lines cracked. Pressure's shot. You're running. How?" Roth shrugged. "Some tanks are just lucky, sir." But the captain wasn't buying it. Next morning, his own tank had one of Roth's clamps on it. Roth never saw who installed it. Didn't ask. Didn't care. By late afternoon, word had spread without a single memo. Crew chiefs from 2 battalions started leaving old clamps on Roth's bench. No names. No questions. Just twisted metal in trays and glances that lingered a second too long. One even brought whiskey. "You didn't get this from me?" the man said, placing a full flask on the corner of Roth's toolbox. "Just keep doing whatever the hell you're doing." Roth tucked the flask into a drawer and got back to work. The grinder sang louder that night. Each clamp he made wasn't just a modification anymore, it was a rumor given shape. A whisper turned into steel. Proof that somewhere someone had figured out how to beat the frost. Officially, nothing had changed. Reports still cited expected cold fatigue. Engineering command still blamed supply chain inconsistencies. But out here, in the bloodless freeze of real war, Roth's clamps were the only damn things holding fuel in place. And war didn't care about regulations. Only results. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. But no one felt it. Not in the Ardennes. Not in the white hell that swallowed men whole and coughed up silence. German armor had broken through the eastern flank near Bastogne. Reports came in scratchy and broken. Tiger tanks, infantry columns advancing fast. American lines were scattered. Infantry dug in between tree lines so frozen, bark cracked like bones. If that ridge fell, the road to the supply depot would lie wide open. And Roth's tank was sitting right on it. Tank 28, Captain Deaver's crew. A heavy Sherman, scarred from weeks of frost, tracks half-iced into place, but it had Roth's clamp beneath its skin. Installed under silence 2 nights ago. No signature. No log. Just faith in a strip of salvaged steel. Next to it, Tank 34 standard issue. No modification. Same age. Same class. The order was simple. Hold the ridge until the 101st repositioned. At 0640 the panzers came. They emerged from mist like beasts, gray and hulking, treads snarling over snowdrifts, turrets already turning. The first shot split a pine in half. Shards of wood rained down like shrapnel. Devers shouted, "Engage!" Both Shermans fired at once. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder in a cathedral. Then the cold struck. Tank 34 stuttered. Its engine whined, coughed, stalled. Inside the hull, its crew scrambled to restart the block, slapping frozen switches and praying to gods they hadn't spoken to since basic. But nothing. The clamp had failed. The pressure dropped. Fuel line sagged, dead, and exposed. German shells bracketed its position in seconds. The third found home. Tank 34 disappeared in a bloom of white and fire. Snow turned red. The turret landed 10 yards away, upside down and silent. But Tank 28, still running. Roth's clamp held. Captain Devers reversed into cover, reloaded, pivoted, and fired 3 more rounds, each one tighter, more precise, angry. The third shot punched into a panzer's side armor like a stake into a coffin. One Tiger halted. Another wavered. Infantry behind the tanks faltered. Devers called out over the net. Engine holding. Pressure stable. God bless this bastard tank. The line held for 3 more hours. Long enough for the 101st to arrive. Long enough to stop the breach. Roth wasn't on the ridge. He didn't see the fire, or the dead, or the enemy retreating. But he heard about it that night. A gunner limped into the depot with frostbitten hands and haunted eyes. "You Roth?" he asked. Roth nodded, still holding a clamp mid-grind. The soldier smiled with broken teeth. Whatever you did to our tank, you saved our goddamn lives. Roth didn't answer. He just handed him a rag and walked back to his workbench. Behind him, someone whispered, "He's not a mechanic. He's a miracle worker with a wrench." But Roth didn't believe in miracles. Just tension, torque, and steel that didn't bend when it mattered. Victory bells rang across the snow-covered depot, not church bells, but engines. Roaring, rumbling, returning. Reinforcements had broken the siege line near Bastogne just after dawn, pushing back German armor like ice cracking under a boot heel. For the first time in weeks, the snow didn't feel like death. Felt like survival. Roth was still grinding clamps. Even with the storm easing, even with the enemy pulling back, he hadn't slowed. Every time a tank came back, he counted how many hadn't. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just kept shaping illegal steel by lantern light, hands black with grease, knuckles cracked from cold and pressure. He didn't hear the footsteps, didn't notice the smell of pipe smoke until it was close. Then the flap lifted. Captain Garver entered, tall, broad-shouldered, sidearm holstered, decorations lining his chest like sharp-edged memories. He had the gait of someone who had killed men up close and negotiated with generals an hour later. A man who didn't bluff, he offered options. Roth froze. Grinder still spinning, clamp half-finished, sweat dripping into his collar. Garver didn't speak at first, just stood in the tense opening, pipe in his mouth, observing the workbench, the modified clamps stacked neatly like silent rebels waiting to be deployed. "You're the one," Garver said finally, voice low. "The clamps. The tanks that didn't die." Roth didn't confirm, didn't deny. "Sir, we're just doing field repairs. Salvage work." Garver took out his pipe. "You do know I could have you court-martialed for what's on this table?" Roth didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. And you know I've lost 17 tanks in the last 9 days. 3 of them stalled before firing a single round." Roth nodded. Garver stepped closer. The floor creaked under his boots. From inside his greatcoat he pulled a paper bag, thick, oiled canvas, sealed tight. He dropped it on the bench with a heavy thud. Roth stared. Inside were 6 clamps. Modified. Bent. Drilled. Identical to his own. Garver leaned closer. "Installed on my lead column this morning. They start better. They run cleaner. They don't fail." He pulled a folded report from his coat pocket, stared at it for a second, then ripped it in half. "No inspection logs will include these. You understand." Roth said nothing. Garver exhaled smoke. "We're not in a war for paperwork, Sergeant. We're in a war for seconds. You gave my men seconds. That's all I care about." He tapped the bench once, a solid, commanding knock. Then, without another word, turned and left. Roth stood frozen for a moment longer, staring at the bag. Officially, nothing had changed. No medal. No commendation. No duseresation. But the chain of command had just stepped into his tent, stared at the truth and walked away whistling. And that was permission. Unwritten, unstated, undeniable. January 1945. The snows melted slowly that year. Not with grace but with weight. Slush turned to rivers of brown memory across the depot grounds. The tanks no longer steamed. They slept. Quiet steel giants, caked with soot and frostbite, lined up in rows like warhorses waiting for a world that didn't need them anymore. The enemy had retreated. The lines had held. But no one mentioned the clamps. The war didn't end with a bang for Roth. It ended with a transfer slip. Polite handshake. A final oil change. His last modified tank, number 53, left the yard on January 8th. Engine humming steady. Crew oblivious to the piece of unauthorized steel bolted beneath their feet. Back at Engineering Command, reports had started to show statistical improvements in sub-zero tank operations. Fuel pressure incidents dropped. Stall rates down. But no one traced it to the depot at Bastogne. No one named Roth. Lockheed engineers filed a new clamp design in March. The memo claimed a revision based on cold weather field data. No mention of salvaged A-20 struts. No mention of grinding wheels and bloody knuckles. No mention of Roth. And he never asked. After discharge in 46, Roth returned to Nebraska. Married. Quietly. Opened a tractor repair shop on a stretch of cracked highway outside Clay Center. No sigboard. Just a shed, a dog, and a smell of diesel that stuck to your clothes for days. He never told his daughters what he did in the war. Not really. Sometimes, when they were young, he'd joke that he tightened bolts while braver men made noise. And they believed him, because he never said otherwise. But in the back of his shop, behind the arc welder and a sagging workbench, hung a strange artifact. A steel clamp, C-shaped, heavier than most. 2 drill holes on either end, slightly misaligned, the mark of a man working under pressure, not perfection. It was mounted on a pegboard, next to a faded photo. 5 tank crewmen grinning in front of a Sherman. Snow all around. No names. No date. Just oil-stained smiles and eyes that had seen too much and come back anyway. When a local boy once asked him, "What's that clamp from, Mr. Roth?" Roth just replied, "Cold winter. Long time ago. Nothing more." In 1992, a military historian researching unregistered field modifications found whispers of Roth's work buried in old motor pool logs. Serial numbers didn't match. Tolerances looked wrong. But the results? Undeniable. Survival rates in modified vehicles had spiked. Word of mouth had spread faster than paperwork. It was innovation without permission. The historian tracked Roth down. By then, he was 74, still turning wrenches, still refusing to sit still. "Do you remember the clamp, Sergeant?" Roth smiled. "Don't know what you mean." The historian persisted. Finally, Roth sighed, wiped his hands on a red rag, and looked out the shop window, toward a snow-covered tractor he'd been fixing that morning. "War doesn't always need heroes," he said. "Sometimes it just needs someone to notice something's wrong, and care enough to fix it." He never published a memoir, never spoke at a ceremony. But the clamps? They kept showing up. In museums, in veteran toolboxes, in mechanic folklore passed down in whispers at reunions. And one still hangs on a wall outside Clay Center, Nebraska. Unlabeled, uncelebrated, unforgettable.